The dramatic changes underway in the South and the nation produced surprising outcomes. At the end of the Civil War, white Southerners were defeated and resentful, whereas black Southerners celebrated Jubilee, their deliverance from bondage. Northerners likewise celebrated because they had preserved the Union and extinguished slavery in the United States. But great questions remained. What role would recently freed slaves play in American life? What rights would they possess? What obligations did the federal government have to ensure a meaningful freedom? For Washington, the first order of business was reestablishing loyal governments in the South and bringing the region back into a normal relationship with the nation. No precedents guided this process, and grand constitutional questions about the nature of the Union and the meaning of Republican governments acquired real political weight. Republicans and Democrats, Northerners and Southerners, and blacks and whites divided over the answers to these questions. The wartime task of reunion gave way to the post-war task of Reconstruction, which entailed reorganizing the Southern political system and rebuilding shattered public and private institutions. A glaring question that confronted freed people was what work they would do. Across the South, black Southerners faced several choices: wage labor, renting land to farm themselves, sharecropping, or some combination of the three. Many thousands made the choice of leaving the farms and plantations on which they had been raised behind in favor of a new, if uncertain, life somewhere else. Often they moved to cities, most overcrowded from the influx of refugees during the war. Memphis and Nashville both grew by more than a third between 1860 and 1870, while Atlanta's population more than doubled. The movement of freed people into southern cities created a labor glut, and the problem of unemployment exacerbated white fears of black criminality. In rural areas, labor contracts and work were the most pressing priorities. Very few enslaved people owned any real estate before the war, which required them to work for wages. The main challenge was working out fair and enforceable contracts with former masters and other whites. The Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Land, usually called the Freedmen's Bureau, established within the Army in the early 1865, helped adjudicate labor disputes in the summer and fall of 1865. Led by former Union General Oliver Otis Howard, the Bureau also distributed food rations to blacks and whites during the hard winter that followed and initiated the building of schools, hospitals, and other communal institutions. Despite this important work, elite Southerners resented the intrusion of the federal government and joined with Northern Democrats to denounce the Bureau as an unnecessary federal imposition on states' rights. Even as white Southerners lamented the war's outcome, they sought the easiest path toward readmission to the Union in hopes of restoring some measure of normality in the South, and because it might allow them to retain authority over the freed people. So despite their vigorous pursuit of independence and their wartime insistence that the Confederacy was a separate nation, many Southerners assumed that they could quickly and easily resume their old position within the United States. Northern Democrats largely agreed. They had long believed that Southerners could not actually leave the Union, so restoration of rights, especially property rights for Southern whites, would be a simple matter of affirming their future loyalty. Republicans resisted these easy terms, but fought amongst themselves about the proper way to rebuild the nation's political system. White Southerners also grappled with restoring order in their communities and explaining defeat to themselves. This proved particularly challenging for Southern men. In the pre-war era, white men had claimed authority by promising to protect and care for members of Southern society they viewed as inferior to them, including women, children, and black people. Confederate defeat revealed the failure of paternalism. Southern women in particular had been forced to assume new burdens and responsibilities during the war. Many had worked in male occupations, including industrial enterprises, and they had managed plantations and household budgets. The ethic of mutuality that developed in some rural communities around the South came more from necessity than ideology, but it still challenged one of the core aspects of pre-war gender relations. In other places, the effects of war compelled some women to reaffirm hierarchy rather than press forward with changes. To do this, white women relinquished their wartime responsibilities and advocated traditional gender relationships. In 1865, a small group of Republican congressmen and senators had high hopes for a vigorous Reconstruction plan. These men, and a substantially more diverse body of black and white male and female reformers who urged them on, foresaw not just the expansion of free labor, but a redistribution of Southern wealth and an egalitarian political order that included black male suffrage. Between 1865 and 1866, this group, known as the Radical Republicans, went from the margins to the center of the political debate, and they did so largely because Northerners perceived President Andrew Johnson as currying favor with an unrepentant South. The fight that erupted between Johnson and his own party in Congress opened strange new rifts in American politics and propelled Republicans toward a surprising and dramatic shift in Reconstruction. In a series of clashes with Johnson, congressional Republicans adopted increasingly radical measures meant to secure the fruits of Union victory in the war and protect the rights of the freed people. As the uncertainty of spring gave way to summer, Southern whites confidently assumed they would be allowed to continue with self-reconstruction. Under this theory, white Southerners reaffirmed their loyalty to the United States through existing political systems. With Congress out of session, Andrew Johnson, the Tennessee Unionist who had become president after Lincoln's assassination, set the terms. Despite radicals' hopes that Johnson would impose strict conditions on the re-entry of Southern states, he set the bar low. Southerners needed to repudiate secession and state debts incurred during the war and confirm emancipation by ratifying the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery in the United States. Johnson also extended amnesty to most of the high-ranking military and civilian officials of the Confederacy. Over the summer of 1865, Johnson restored voting and property rights to thousands of these men. In some cases, this process divested black families of land they had been given by the U.S. Army during the war. But before the war, Johnson was a bitter enemy of the plantation elite and championed the cause of white artisans and non-slaveholding farmers of East Tennessee. But in his efforts to keep pace with the shifting political alignments of the post-war era, he became a staunch defender of white supremacy and recast himself as the defender of embattled white elites. In the autumn of 1865, Southern states held new state elections. In the Upper South, a significant number of former Whigs and Unionists won, but voters in the Lower South largely re-elected Democratic Party elites who had led the region during the war. Most Northerners, and even some Democrats, reacted with shock and anger. But Johnson accepted the results as a product of the democratic process. Radical Republicans, however, grew increasingly uneasy with his leniency toward the South. Forced to accept emancipation, reconstituted state governments across the region adopted a series of laws known collectively as the Black Codes in the fall of 1865, which prescribed both the extent and limits of freedom for black residents in the region. Many black Southerners and many Northerners perceived the Black Codes as a blatant attempt to reimpose slavery throughout the region. The codes also focused not just on ex-slaves, but on all, quote, freed people, free Negroes, and mulattoes, end quote, effectively creating a new legal designation in Southern law that singled out black people where previously status, i.e. free or slave, had been the key distinction among residents. For Northerners, the second half of 1865 proved nearly as disorienting as the first half. Just as they had experienced the elation of victory and anguish over Lincoln's assassination, Northerners moved from supporting Johnson's initial measures to reconstruct the South quickly to anger at Johnson's capitulation to Southern arrogance. Carl Schurz, a prominent Civil War general and radical Republican, had been sent on a tour of the South by Johnson in late 1865 to assess the situation, but his findings undercut support for Johnson's policies. White Southerners, Schurz found, did not think of themselves as Americans and did not trust black Southerners to work in a new free labor economy. As Congress reconvened in December 1865, its members heavily weighed the merits and methods of reconstructing the South. After much debate, Congress slowed down the process of Reconstruction by refusing to seat the delegations recently elected from Southern states. During the war, Union and Confederate forces alike had destroyed huge swaths of the Southern landscape, tearing down fence rails for firewood and tearing up railroads to weaken the Confederates' ability to fight. Most economically damaging of all was emancipation, which represented a capital loss of at least $3 billion for white Southerners. By one estimate, slave property comprised 60% of all wealth in the Deep South cotton states. Freed people thus entered the labor market during a period of severe contraction, with most farmers possessing little cash with which to pay workers. Because of the immediate necessity for freed people to sign a contract of some sort and begin earning money, they were in a poor position to negotiate with landowners. Agents of the Freedmen's Bureau served as the only check on exploitative labor agreements. Freedmen's Bureau agents settled labor disputes when they arose, but the Bureau never fielded more than 900 agents in the whole South, which rarely amounted to more than one per county. Despite the importance of their work, Johnson and congressional Democrats denounced the Freedmen's Bureau as an unwarranted extension of federal power. A typical political cartoon condemned the Bureau as, quote, an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man, end quote. And while most Republicans remained committed to a limited government, and many were concerned about the constitutional issues raised by the Bureau, most regarded the work as too important to abandon. In 1866, Congress approved a one-year renewal of the Bureau. Johnson vetoed the bill, and, in a sign of growing Republican solidarity, Congress overrode his veto. Fresh from his defeat over the renewal of the Freedmen's Bureau, Johnson picked another fight with Congress, this time over the 1866 Civil Rights Act. The first instance of federal law designed expressly to protect the rights of citizens rather than prohibiting the actions of government. The bill was authored by moderate Republican Lyman Trumbull of Illinois and was intended as a middle ground between radicals who wanted strong intervention in southern states and conservatives who feared the centralizing nature of such action. The bill established a common national citizenship for all people born in the United States and promised the, quote, full and equal benefit of all laws and proceedings for the security of person and property, end quote. It also empowered federal courts to hear violations of rights, but the bill mainly protected people against state rather than private action. Johnson refused to accept even this moderate measure and vetoed the bill. His explanation, as with his earlier veto of the Freedmen's Bureau, conveyed his refusal to accept the centralization of power initiated by the bill. Johnson also made white supremacy an important part of his veto, arguing that by granting black Americans equal access to the law, it denied rights to whites. And, to Johnson's horror, the bill seemed to grant a, quote, perfect equality of the white and colored races, end quote. But Congress again overrode Johnson and enacted the legislation. Johnson's opposition to these two central measures and his intemperate veto messages ultimately isolated him politically and pushed the sizable body of moderate Republicans closer to the radicals. After the Civil Rights Bill passed, Republicans began debating a broader protection of individual rights. As they discussed what would become the 14th Amendment, Republicans again quarreled amongst themselves about the propriety of creating federal safeguards for individual rights. And again, the moderates won the day, this time crafting a broad guarantee of national citizenship and equality before the law, but offering no specific protection of freed people's political rights. And even as the amendment expanded rights for some, it contracted rights for others. Article 1 of the Constitution refers only to, quote, people in sections on voting, but the 14th Amendment set the minimum requirements as, quote, male inhabitants, who are at least 21 years of age. Shortly after passage of the 14th Amendment, Republicans began working on the 15th Amendment. Ratified in 1870, the amendment issued a blanket prohibition against denying the right to vote on the basis of race. The amendment's failure to enfranchise women incensed women's suffrage advocates who had been working since the 1830s to win women the right to vote. Leading suffrage activists such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had essentially paused their work on this project during the war to help further emancipation. But Congress's failure to consider women's suffrage created deep bitterness and led to tensions within the movement along racial lines. The 15th Amendment also completed a fundamental shift in the language of the Constitution and the American conceptions of freedom. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution all deny the ability of Congress to legislate on certain topics. They provide a, quote, negative liberty by protecting the people from government action. But the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments all concluded with the language of, quote, Congress shall have the power to enforce this provision, end quote. The post-war amendments relied on the idea of what's called positive liberty, which is grants on power to Congress for it to protect the freedom of certain aspects of Americans' lives. In this sense, the Civil War and Reconstruction represent a political revolution in the United States. Thaddeus Stevens, a Pennsylvania Republican, played a key role in the conflict with Johnson and the creation of federal protections for civil rights. Stevens helped lead the radical Republicans in Congress and served as perhaps the ablest and most dedicated white proponent of meaningful freedom for African Americans. In Congress, he used logic, rhetoric, and strong-arm parliamentary tactics to advance his agenda. Like other radicals, he regarded the Southern states as having actually left the Union. He therefore believed that Southern states could be subjected to specific terms before they were granted re-entry into the Union. For Stevens, the most important change, the one compelled by humanity and justice as well as political expediency, was to diminish the clout of the white elites in Southern life and elevate the freed people. Stevens believed that this could only be accomplished if the government broke up the great land holdings of the pre-war era and distributed the land to former slaves. But President Johnson killed a brief experiment with resettlement undertaken by General William T. Sherman in early 1865. Despite Stevens' urging, Republicans could not bring themselves to advocate the redistribution of property. For Stevens, the Southern reaction to the 14th Amendment proved the necessity of radically reordering Southern politics. After quick passage by Congress, the white Southerners overwhelmingly rejected the measure. The boldness of the Southern refusal to consider the 14th Amendment and the increasingly violent racial politics of the region, in which whites killed dozens of African Americans in Memphis and New Orleans during riots in the summer of 1866, pushed Congress to seize control of Reconstruction completely. In March 1867, Congress passed the first of a series of Reconstruction acts. Dramatic in their scope, the legislation consolidated the ex-Confederate states into 5 military districts, with former Union generals acting as military governors. To return to the Union, Congress required states to ratify the 14th Amendment and revise their constitutions to provide for black male voting. And in 1867, the House of Representatives impeached Johnson. The first U.S. president to ever be impeached, he remained in office because the Senate failed to convict him by 1 vote. However, politically, he was powerless. By the end of the year, Republicans turned with relief to selecting Johnson's successor, choosing the enormously popular Union General Ulysses S. Grant. Grant won the election easily in 1868, running on a platform of sectional reconciliation under the slogan, quote, "Let us have peace," end quote. Despite his optimism, little sectional peace prevailed during Grant's presidency. White Southerners resented the changes forced on them through the Reconstruction Acts, but with no voice in Congress besides a few ideologically sympathetic Northern Democrats, they had little choice but to submit. The first charge to the military governors now administering the southern states was to hold elections to select delegates to state constitutional conventions. Black men participated in the election and helped produce a strong Republican victory, including the election of a majority of black delegates in South Carolina and Louisiana. In other southern states, black delegates comprised only a small percent of the delegates, but even that small number invalidated the entire process for most white Southerners. The victories in the South confirmed that the Republican Party would stay competitive in the region as long as they could maintain the support of African American voters. Even as Congress and the president fashioned and refashioned Reconstruction in Washington, black and white Southerners shaped the post-war world on the ground. They disputed the terms of work, housing, property, politics, and social relationships. For black Southerners, the first order of business was to create autonomous lives. True emancipation required not just free individuals, but communities dedicated to uplifting and supporting its members. Politically, Reconstruction entailed creating Republican governments that would implement the policies articulated by Congress. Politics monopolized the public's attention, but the success of Reconstruction and the ability of African Americans to make their freedom real hinged on rebuilding the Southern economy. A key change in Southern life came with the Freedmen's Bureau and their drive to build schools. Before the Civil War, no Southern state maintained a public education system. Northerners viewed education as essential to both political and economic progress. Many Northerners believed that non-slave-holding whites supported secession because they could not dissect the misleading rhetoric of slave-holding elites. African Americans in particular viewed education as essential. Beginning in contraband camps during the war, freed people sought out literacy. Denied to them as slaves, literacy and higher education promised a life beyond the fields and satisfied many people's desire to read the Bible themselves. People of all ages lined up at churches and schools where instruction was available throughout the day and usually well into the evening. Despite complaints from white Southerners about the cost, public education proved one of the lasting accomplishments of the Reconstruction-era governments. But greater access to formal education did not necessarily lead to greater economic mobility or equality. Even though the Civil War ended the split in the U.S. economy between free and slave labor, it did not equalize wages between the two sections or between the races. The South replaced slavery with a low-wage free labor system, and within that, African Americans consistently received lower pay for equivalent work done by white workers. Most black Southerners remained agricultural workers, but very few worked their own land. Instead, Southerners expanded a pre-war practice called sharecropping, in which landless workers signed contracts to take up residence in farm plots of land, often on property belonging to former slaveholders. In exchange for leasing land, property owners claimed 50% or more of the profits at harvest time. When sharecropping first came into use, it met the needs of property owners who required labor to farm the land, but had no money with which to pay wages and workers who wanted more autonomy. Sharecroppers set their own schedules and supervised themselves in the field, but crucially, it was usually landowners who chose the crop. All across the Deep South, and much of Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, that choice was cotton. Merchants, who were among the few actors in the post-war Southern economic system with access to credit, insisted on receiving cotton. The changes in the global cotton market, however, produced price fluctuations and great uncertainty for growers. Adding to the structural problems, white landowners exploited their laborers and merchants and squeezed them on prices for foods and supplies. Egypt and India also entered the global cotton market during the Civil War, adding competition and uncertainty for U.S. producers. As a result, sharecropping quickly trapped farmers in cycles of debt. Most signed the contracts hoping to produce enough to clear a surplus and over time accumulate the money to buy their own land, but this rarely happened, and tenant farming dominated the South for the next 50 years. The results ultimately ensured overuse and poor treatment of Southern lands, a stunted regional economy, and little progress for African American farmers. The Republican state governments established after the Constitutional Conventions in 1867 and 1868 were fragile and awkward alliances between groups with widely divergent interests. Black Southerners represented by far the largest component of the party. They wanted to receive a genuinely fair opportunity to perform work, buy land, gain an education, and live independent lives. But white Northern Republicans, labeled carpetbaggers by conservatives because they assumed Northerners were only coming south to make quick money, focused on economic development. Usually pre-war Whigs or wartime Unionists, white Southerners rarely came to the Republican Party with any interest in black voting or civil rights. Instead, they rejected the Democrats as the party that had pulled the region into secession and war and hoped that a Republican commitment to free labor would create a firm foundation for the New South. Democrats, of course, eagerly exploited the tensions within the Republican Party. In many places, white conservatives had initially boycotted elections that resulted from the Constitutional Conventions of 1867 and 1868. Hoping to undermine the legitimacy of these new governments, they succeeded only in hastening Republican dominance. In other states, some conservatives made alliances with Republicans to create coalition governments. But the 1872 national elections, in which Ulysses S. Grant was reelected despite substantial opposition within his own party, revealed a weakness that Democrats longed to exploit. Beginning in 1873, white conservatives returned to the political system and used charges of corruption to defeat the Republicans. The wide scale of corruption within Grant's administration had even threatened his reelection. Also, the policies that Republicans implemented, especially public education, required new taxes. Before the war, slaveholders and large property owners shouldered most of the tax burden. But with no slave property to tax, post-war state governments imposed property taxes on a much broader range of people. Even though the children of white property owners benefited from public education, they often condemned the taxes required to pay for it. Democrats capitalized on these policy disputes and campaigned vigorously on the platform of white supremacy to retake state governments. In Louisiana, Alabama, and other southern states, this approach yielded electoral victories for Democrats in 1874, 1875, and 1876. The most bitter and violent opponents of Reconstruction, and black freedom more generally, emerged at the very start of the era. In late 1865, a small group of men gathered in Pulaski, Tennessee, and organized the Ku Klux Klan. Membership in the group spread by word of mouth across the state and soon throughout the region. Klan members made denying African Americans any legitimate role in the public sphere their principal goal. But the Klan also terrorized white Republicans, especially native white Southerners who cooperated with the party in their efforts to build an interracial democracy in the South. Klan members whipped, beat, burnt, and killed all manner of community leaders throughout the South. They targeted ministers, teachers, political leaders, and successful businessmen or farmers. The high point of Klan-related violence came in response to the Reconstruction Acts and to the prominent role played by African Americans in the reorganization of Southern life between 1868 and 1871. In a few isolated incidences, President Grant sent U.S. troops back into the South to help quell disorder. Interventions such as these exposed Grant to the charge that his administration had failed to secure the peace, which he promised to do in 1868. It also opened Republicans to criticism from fiscal conservatives about the continuing expense of Reconstruction and, more cynically, to those who felt that black Southerners needed to defend themselves from whites or suffer the consequences. White Southerners also mastered the art of spreading misinformation. They convinced many Northerners that black people simply could not be trusted to participate in democracy. Federal courts also increasingly reflected Northern impatience with the duration and expense of Reconstruction and their reluctance to support black or Republican plaintiffs. The most important of these cases revolved around the defendants arrested for leading the Colfax Massacre. In United States v. Cruikshank, the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment only protected citizens against the official state actions and not private violence. Because the massacre's ringleader, William Cruikshank, operated without state sanction, the amendment offered no protection. Cruikshank went free, and in the process, the court dramatically narrowed the scope of protection offered by the 14th Amendment. The Cruikshank case was decided in 1876, the same year that a new Republican won the presidency. Rutherford B. Hayes, a Union general like his predecessor, Ulysses S. Grant, entered office under a storm of controversy. He secured the office after the contested election of 1876, when Republicans and Democrats clashed over the returns from Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. Both sides ultimately agreed to count the presidential ballots for Hayes, but gave Democrats control at the state level. This ended the last three Republican state governments in the South and initiated an era of Democratic dominance that lasted for most of the next century. Shortly after his inauguration, Hayes recalled the last few thousand U.S. troops out of the South, officially ending the period of Reconstruction.